So I'd like to start this talk by quoting what is probably the most recognizable, famous or infamous extract from Hugh McDermid's A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, published in 1926. So I'll go through this. You canna gang to a barn supper, even where it's some wizen's crunt o' an Knocknee. Chiney turns round to say him haggis very good, and 10 to 1 the piper is at Cockney. Crews London Scotties with their braw shirt fronts, and their fancy friends, rejoicing that similar gatherings in Timbuktu, Baghdad, and hell nae doubt, are voicing Burns's sentiments of universal love in pidgin English or in wildfowl Scots. And toasting in was not to them but an excuse for feathering genius with their thoughts. I's warrant Burns would shite clear all the Honor Burns Club stay, or 99 of them, and haud his birthday in a different kip, for his name is not tarn in vain. As Christ gid Jerusalem's Pharisees the slip. As Kirks with Christianity had done, Burns Clubs with Burns. We think it's the same. The core ocht is only for the few, scorned by the many, thrang with its empty name. So here's probably the most recognizable and influential assessment of Burns's memory in 20th century Scottish literature. This odd mixture of elitism, Anglophobia, xenophobia, and anti-imperialism, defending Burns's revolutionary radical genius against the kirk of his Pharisee admirers. This is an integral part of McDermid's self-fashioned legend as both an iconoclast and Burns's only faithful heir. Certainly, this egotistic, controversial narrative was key for the identity of the Scottish Renaissance movement. It influenced large sections of 20th century Scottish criticism, and it still shapes simplified views of Scottish literature in the present day. Yet such canonization of McDermid's Drunk Man raises a few problems for anyone who'd like to understand the broader reception of Burns in the early 20th century. Firstly, it gives the wrong impression that McDermid's reading of Burns was idiosyncratic, that was born in a vacuum, an idea which has fed both McDermid's fandom and those who have mocked his eccentricity. Instead, what I'd like to emphasize here is the intertextual context of A Drunk Man, a poem which owed to at least 10 years of vivid political and literary debates about Burns. And secondly, I'd also like to show that by focusing a little too much on A Drunk Man, we tend to miss McDermid's real, and this time properly idiosyncratic, contribution to Burns' criticism, which he didn't make in 1926 in that poem, but in the following years in 1927 and 1928. So let me explain first by looking at the intertextual context of A Drunk Man, because indeed, McDermid's key idea here in the poem, in the lines that I've just read, that Burns's both poetic and radical message has been corrupted by his bourgeois, un-Scottish admirers, was not new in 1926. In fact, as far back as 1820, we find the new Burns Club of Kilbarcan, created in reaction to the upper-class Paisley Burns Club, and aiming to discuss Burns's contribution to the ideal of radical democracy while serving a frugal meal of bread, cheese, and water instead of the classic fancy three-course meal watered with whiskey. Such countercultural attempts to unsettle the mainstream, often middle-class, Tory, or liberal Burns movement continued sporadically throughout the 19th century. But it was not until the Great War that they became exacerbated. The reason was that the First World War led to an unprecedented hijacking of Burns's image for the war effort. From the British Parliamentary Recruiting Committee, whose poster that you can see here urged Scotsmen to take Burns's tip and go and be a soldier, to the martial rhetoric of the Tory direction of the Burns Federation, the official association of Burns clubs, which reprinted anti-pacifist slogans in their annual The Burns Chronicle, to countless uses of Burns's warlike songs, Scots wha hae wi Wallace bled, and the Dumfries Volunteers by mainstream media and Kirk ministers, the bard's memory was definitely requisitioned for king and country. Yet, as the war dragged on with a rising death toll, well, such propaganda triggered increasingly angry reactions from Scottish pacifists, left-wingers, or nationalists, who, by contrast, sought to use Burns's radical message to subvert this dominant, jingoistic, unionist narrative. Most of those critiques exposed the apparent hypocrisy of mainstream Burns clubs, who didn't hesitate to corrupt Burns's message of universal peace, that man to man shall brothers be, in support of British war effort. This was evident, for instance, in the works of socialist consensus objector John Smith Clarke, here on the slide, whose 1917 pamphlet, The Story of Robert Burns, was re-edited twice by the Clydeside Workers' Committee. This pamphlet aimed to rescue a worthy proletarian personality from the hands of the Philistine, whilst producing an anti-militaristic and quasi-Bolshevik portrait of Burns, the rebel. Likewise, in January 1922, the Journal of the Independent Labour Party Forward contrasted Burns's sans-culottian fervour with the bourgeois that filled themselves up with haggis and whiskey before going home to plot how they can reduce colliers' wages. On a more separatist, also xenophobic note, the Journal of the Scottish Home Rule Association, Liberty, led by Gaelic activists William Gillies and Rory Erskine of Mar, read, "Unfortunately, part of Burns's influence seems to begin and end with the immortal memory, proposed amid the artificial atmosphere of irrational, adulatory excesses. But the real influence of Burns is to be found at work in the hearts of the common people of all lands. That he would have made pungent remarks about the Highlands being turned into a happy hunting ground for American pork kings, Cockney profiteers, and foreign kilties, we have no doubt. We are certain that he would have used his influence on behalf of the hardy sons of rustic toil in the Highlands, who for nearly a century have demanded land on which to rear their families in health and plenty." So no doubt that the provocative tone of such publications left their mark on the young Christopher Murray Grieve, who at the time was a keen member of both the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, and of the Scottish Home Rule Association. But before we return to McDermott, we also need to mention at least two important books of literary criticism whose line of argument, rather similar to the more militant kind of publications that I've just quoted, aimed to drive a wedge between what they saw as the authentic Burns and his corrupted bourgeois reception. The first of these is Edwin Muir's 1924 essay, Latitudes, which included a chapter on Burns, and perhaps the first of its kind to make a clean sweep and reject all previous scholarship about the poet, which Muir deemed as either too respectable or too sentimental. The problem with this middle-class, sentimental misreading of Burns, according to Muir, was that it used the poet's tedious, corny love songs to obscure the lusty themes of his best works, including Cornrigs, Tam Glen, or The Jolly Beggars. In other words, the prurient taste of bourgeois Burnsians was not only a bane on Scottish politics, but also on Scottish criticism, according to Muir. A similar argument could also be found in 1926 in an essay by William Power, a rather forgotten character today, nationalist writer, Protestant journalist, future co-founder and president of the SNP, and who, as you'll see, is rather important in the story that I'm trying to tell tonight. In Robert Burns and other essays and sketches, Power brings together the political and literary critique of the Burns movement. I quote, "The average Burns Club is solidly middle class in composition and sentiment, and the proposer of the immortal memory would be reasonably safe in combining his laudation of Burns with a denunciation of socialist doctrines. For nearly a century, the wrangling bench of poets, critics, ministers, doctors, judges, peers, MPs, bailies, journalists, scribes, and Pharisees, publicans, and sinners, and deadheads, and buddies, and axe grinders of all sorts have torn the bard's poor corpse to pieces afresh at every Burns supper." Against those ritualistic Pharisees who sucked the life out of Burns's works, Power's essay aimed to revitalize Burns' studies by broadening their scope and comparing the bard's poetry to the verses of Scottish medieval makers like William Dunbar and Robert Henryson, and to the themes of European poets, including Pierre de Ronsard, François Villon, and Heinrich Heine. For sure, Power's effort was not lost on McDermid, who was drafting A Drunk Man when Power's book came out. As a hopeful Burnsian, the young McDermid had tried in vain to sway the politics of the conservative Burns Federation in the early 1920s. Embittered by his failure, McDermid was to find inspiration in this mixture of political and literary criticism, which, from the journals Forward and Liberty to Muir and Power's essays, encouraged him to reject both the entire movement of Burns clubs and the previous Burns scholarship to recover instead the supposedly authentic, revolutionary, nationalist, and European poetry of Burns. In other words, the first 100 lines of A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle can be read as a great, controversial synthesis of the post-war debate on Burns. If I return to the extract quoted in introduction, we can see that it combines, one, the xenophobia of liberty against foreign Highlandism, two, the socialist critique of the imperial bourgeoisie with their broad-shirt front and their posh southern pronunciation of simila, for instance, and three, the image of Burnsians as false followers, as Pharisees and sinful publicans, as already found in William Power's essay. So by rejecting the Burns movement in this way, the drunk man is then free to embrace a more positive approach to Burns, reviving his potential as a both national and international hero. This is seen later in the poem. For instance, when McDermid uses the rather quaint image of the hail-braid earth having turned a reed rose during the general strike of 1926. Or towards the end of the poem, in the long address to Dostoevsky, when McDermid describes himself and the Russian novelist as two gangrel buddies, a phrase found in Burns's Jolly Beggars, and which is a rather subtle way to reintegrate Burns into this sacrosanct, self-fashioned trilogy of literary heroism uniting McDermid, Burns, and Dostoevsky as a symbol of continental finesse. So if I try to recap here, by rejecting the Burns movement, whilst preserving Burns's radical poetics, McDermid's Drunk Man was not so much innovative as synthetic, bringing together more than 10 years of Burnsian discussions. Now, in the second part of this presentation, I'd like to move beyond A Drunk Man into the years 1927 and 1928 to find what was McDermid's truly novel and somewhat nihilistic take on Burns's legacy. The reason why McDermid departed from the balance of A Drunk Man, that balance between the rejection of the Burns cult on the one hand and the preservation of a radical Burns on the other hand, the reason why I think he departed, it's an interpretation, I think was both cultural and political. Culturally first, with the creation of Scottish Pen in 1927, an organization which was conceived quite clearly by McDermid and his followers as the modernist rival of the traditional Burns Federation and which exacerbated the fight between Burnsians and revivalists. Maybe an aspect of Scottish pen history, which is a bit forgotten today, but very present at the time. Then politically in 1928, with the creation of the National Party of Scotland, a fully separatist party which led McDermott to break affiliation with Labour after its failure to deliver Home Rule for Scotland in 1924 and 1927. So by breaking not just with the Burns Federation, which had already more or less been achieved in The Drunk Man anyway, but also by breaking with Labour, McDermott further departed from a vision of Burns that conflated his work with a limited, perhaps timorous approach to Scottish self-rule. In other words, maybe Burns was not the best figurehead anymore for McDermott's pro-independence project. And this is what we see in the 1927 essay, quite famous, Albin, where McDermott advocated a realistic approach to Scottish independence as opposed to the sentimental trust in Labour Home Rulers. He did that while simultaneously contrasting the brilliance of William Dunbar and his medieval Scots to the 18th century conventionalism of Robert Burns. So independence and Dunbar on the one hand, and sentimental Home Rule and Burns on the other. So here, the balance of A Drunk Man is broken. There's no distinction made between Burns's poetry and Burns's influence. Both are rejected in the famous slogan, "Not Burns, Dunbar." In doing so, McDermott increased the gap that needed bridged by Scottish revivalists. It was no longer enough to erase the Kailyard of the 19th century. Younger Scottish poets now had to jump over 500 years for the Renaissance to be complete, reaching back to the fantasy of a pure, un-English Scotland, which Burns's corrupted bilingualism could never match. Such a comparison between Burns and Dunbar was not completely new. It could be found elsewhere in William Power, we've just seen, in John Buchan as well, or even in the 19th century poetry of Algernon Swinburne. Yet McDermott's uncompromising approach was now driving the Renaissance in a way which would soon divide its own members as well as Scottish public opinion. In January 2028, McDermott gave an ironical immortal memory speech at the Burns Supper of Glasgow nationalists. There, he stated that Burns had become a liability for his own nation and that we must forget him for at least 100 years to give it a chance of realizing the aims for which he wrought. This quote was reprinted in the Daily Record, where it created a huge furore with angry comments powering down from both Burns clubs and Labour politicians, including the ex-Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, who stated that Burns was too tenderly human and too sturdily manly ever to become remote from the living generations of Scotsmen. Yet, McDermott could also count on a few faithful followers. During the Daily Record furore, he was backed by the young Neil Gunn, who in the Scots magazine attacked the kinds of corrupted Anglo-Scots who toast Burns comically. McDermott also received support from William Power, whose Protestant journal, the Scots Observer, compared the modernist poet Christopher Murray Grieve to a heroic John Knox of literary criticism, excommunicated for breaching the Burnsian peace and liberating Scotland with a new wave of spiritual reformation. There would be a lot more to say, I think, on Power's Knoxian stance here, not least considering that hardline Protestantism had been the most consistent opponent of Burns and of his memory since Burns wrote Holy Willie's Prayer, for instance. So there is a kind of strange continuity here between 19th century angry Protestantism towards Burns and Scottish modernism, something that probably would need more research, but we can maybe also save that one for the discussion. More significantly still, I think McDermott's Iconoclasm had a strong, though scarcely noticed, influence on Lewis Grassic Gibbon's Sunset Song, published a few years later in 1932. Indeed, Gibbon's novel is in many ways about the sunset of Burns's songs. In the novel, Burns's works feature as part of Scotland's peasant culture. To a mouse is stuttered by old Putty, whilst Bonny Wee Thing is crooned by the socialist Long Rob of the Mill. Yet by the end of the novel, after a Long Rob has died in the mud of the trenches, and as old Putty succumbs to dementia, Chris Guthrie and other villagers failed to remember Burns's traditional airs. I quote, "And you minded Long Rob right well. You minded him singing out there in the morning. You heard fain the Michael of those old songs now. They were daft and old-fashioned. There were fine new ones in their places, right from America, folk said, and all about the queer blue babies that were born there." Walking in McDermott's footsteps here, Gibbon presents Burns as a forgotten reference in the modern world of post-war industrial Scotland. Nonetheless, not everyone in the Renaissance movement agreed to leave Burns to the dustbin of history. In January 1930, a certain Catherine Carswell responded to yet another of McDermott's anti-Burnsian charges written in the magazine Radio Times. There, McDermott blamed Burns's memory for keeping Scotland furled to that spirit of democracy which was being so comprehensively challenged in the rest of Europe by fascist and communist revolutions, two options which McDermott thought were far more exciting. Well, that was a step too far for Carswell, who retorted that despite the vulgar sentimentalism of the Burns cult, I quote, "No poet who maintains his place in the affection of the unliterary can at any period fail to inspire the interest and respect of the few critics who count in any generation. In what other country would serious writers have been deterred by the existence of a cult from constant discussion and re-examination of so remarkable a phenomenon?" This reply, which of course infuriated McDermott, was actually part of Carswell's clever marketing plan to make room for herself in the contemporary debate ahead of the publication of her Life of Robert Burns in September 1930. Indeed, Carswell rejected the nihilistic turn of McDermott in Albin, siding instead with the softer iconoclasm of a drunk man who back in 1926 still believed that Burns's legacy could be reformed, escaping his bourgeois worshippers. And this is precisely what Carswell set to do in her radical, sexually liberated biography of Burns, which would receive so much flack from traditional Burnsians that McDermott eventually agreed to reconcile with her. Yet McDermott and Carswell's reconciliation should not make us forget that deeper tension that ran throughout the Scottish Renaissance movement between those with McDermott from 1928 that agreed to bury Burns's Anglo-Scottish world for good, and those who sought to preserve it in reformed, radicalized form. And certainly similar questions abide today, at a time when, against McDermott's wishes, Burns's shrine culminates over the status quo of Scottish devolution, whilst regular polemics about his alleged sexism, republicanism, or whiteness are regularly stirred in the press and on social media. So between iconoclasm and reformation, there lies Burns's afterlife in modern and contemporary Scottish literature. Before I leave you, I mean, I'm not leaving you, I'm staying here for the question, but before I conclude, I should say that more details and reflections in this vein can be found in the forthcoming monograph that Scott mentioned in introduction, Robert Burns in Scottish Cultural Politics, which is available for pre-orders with a special January promo code that you can see on the screen here. I mean, it's still obviously very expensive, like any academic hardback these days, unfortunately. But for those of you who might like to learn more about the relationship between Burns and politics in the 20th century, McDermott, Carswell, and many others, well, I hope you'll indulge my recommendation. Thanks very much, and cheers, everyone.